You're listening to the Healthy Creative Ministry podcast with Matt Curtis. This is the podcast that helps you take your creative ministry from wherever you are today to healthy and effective.
Is it time for me to quit my job? This is such a difficult question for me to answer in a one-way conversation. What I want to do in this week's episode of the podcast is I want to give you the forks in the road that I often present in the context of a conversation about this. Is it time for me to move on? Now, I want to preface this by saying, typically when people are having this conversation with me, it's not because a bunch of opportunities have opened up and they're trying to assess which of these 5 amazing job offers should I take. Usually the issue is I am not interested in tolerating the frustration of my job much longer, but I feel a little bit guilty moving on because churches are good at making us feel guilty about moving on. So can I move on? Should I move on? Are the problems that I'm facing even something that we can overcome? So this is the way I approach this conversation. Feel free to answer these questions as you see fit. If you find yourself on the brink of quitting or asking yourself this question, is it time? Should I be moving on? My hope is that going through this process will even be helpful, even though it's a little bit more of a one-way conversation. So the place I always start, do you want to leave? Is that something that you would like to do? Do you want to move on? Or would you rather try to make where you are better? What I find to be really interesting is that this is one of those questions that kind of puts you in a corner. And I feel like sometimes those are very helpful questions to get you unstuck. Where we tend to get paralyzed when it comes to moving on from our jobs, specifically working in churches, is we hem and we haw. We go back and forth between the two positions because it's hard for us to let go of all of the things that we have in our job. Because our job, working at a church, isn't just a job. It is a job. It is a community of people. It is the place where we worship. It's everything. In a lot of cases, it's our social network as well. All of the people that we're connected with in life as employees of a church staff tend to be tied to our church. So if we're going to move on, we're going to be giving up everything. And I mean everything. So it's a really hard place for us to be because it's not just, I don't like my job and so I want to move on. It's, I don't like my job. It's really stressful. I don't feel like things are going in a good direction, but I don't want to lose all my family, friends, except all these different things that are woven into this reality of serving on a church staff. So the first question there of do you want to leave is really important because sometimes we do. It is okay for you to want to move on. There were plenty of times where I wanted to move on. Now, there were plenty of times where I wanted to move on and I wasn't able to move on. The doors weren't opening. I wasn't able to find jobs that were a good fit. But starting there, what we want to do is we want to avoid being stuck in a land of indecision. Make a decision and begin operating in that direction. So if you want to leave, great. Then start working through the process of what it looks like to leave. I don't mean start packing your boxes. I mean start looking for a job. If you're at the caliber of position where you want to work with a search firm, great. Then call the search firm. Have an interview. I got stuck for a while because I was afraid to have that first conversation with a search firm. And at some point, I met with an executive pastor. That was the aspiration that I was pursuing. I met with somebody outside of our church, and I said, hey, this is kind of what I'm thinking about. Talk to me about what the first steps are. Like, I don't even know if I'm qualified to be an executive pastor. And he said, great, well, then apply to be an executive pastor somewhere. I'm like, whoa. Are you crazy? That's not how this goes. And he said, the best way to know if you're qualified is to find out if you're qualified. And I thought, oh man, that's actually really true. But it all started with me wanting to leave enough, having an aspiration to leave to something. It's not just a matter of what are you leaving from, but what do you want to go to? What is that thing that you're desiring? Is it more leadership? Is it an opportunity to grow in a new specialty? What is it specifically that you want to be going to? That's the do you want to go part of this. And then there's the other side, or do you want to make where you are better? When I ask this question to people, it's really interesting because, again, like I've prefaced this before, These are typically conversations where people are really frustrated. When you work with churches that need healthy communications or healthy creative ministry, and they don't have it, most of the conversations that I have, the starting point is let's assess how unhealthy things are. But when I present those options, the clarity that comes almost immediately, oh, no, I want to stay. I want to make this place better. So sometimes what happens is we think we want to leave our jobs, but it's actually because we've lost hope. We no longer believe that we can make where we are better. We don't believe that we can make progress in a meaningful way in our current environment. So let's just say you can. Now what? Do you want to leave or do you want to make where you are better? Once you have that answer, you start moving in the direction and you're going to pay attention. Are doors opening for you? What are the pros and cons of these new opportunities if you're finding them? You're going to evaluate those things and you're going to measure it all out. If you're wanting to stay, then there's going to be some decisions that you need to make in terms of tactical, inward-oriented, how do I help make this organization better? But really, it's important for you, no matter which of those you answer, if you say you want to go or if you say you want to stay. If you had to stay, what would you do to address the frustrations that you face? Because the reality is that even if you want to go, it doesn't mean you're going to go, at least not immediately. There were stretches for me where I wanted to leave for years, but the right opportunity just didn't show up. So recognize just because you want to move on doesn't mean that you let go of everything that you're investing in. So have that conversation. If you had to stay, you had no option, what would you do to address the frustrations that you face? What would change about the way you approach your day job? What would you do differently? You're going to go through and you're going to start identifying some of the specific problems, and then you're going to work towards solving them. Because here's the reality. I had a belief for a while that maybe I could just go to another organization and all my frustrations would be fixed. Well, that's great if all of my frustrations are truly because of other people. But there's a good chance that your frustrations are actually connected to you, at least some of them. I know they were for me. I actually went through this exact scenario where I did quit my job. And then I went back to my old job that I quit, that was burning me out. And I had to say to myself, what am I going to address? Because I can't leave. Like I can't double quit. Like I can fake quit once, but you got to give a little bit of time after that first fake quit, So I went back to the drawing board. I know that the way that I was approaching things was not working. So what am I going to do differently? This is where the 4 Creative course comes in. I'll put a link in the description here in the show notes because the language is really helpful when it comes to assessing this stuff. Do you need to rebuild your systems? Are they broken? Is that where your frustration's coming from? Do you need to learn new skills to help you be fully equipped? Do you need to assess your heart? Is your attitude the problem? Are you really critical of other people? Are you not gracious? Are you just miserable to work with? Those are all real questions that you have to answer. That's part of the assessing your heart part of things. And then growing your imagination. Are you really investing in the things that can help your organization from a creative point of view? Now, you may be thinking to yourself, I don't understand. I thought this was an episode about should I quit my job? Well, yes, it is. And here's why this matters. Because if the assumption is that you're going to go to another place and everything's better, but some of the things that you're bringing to the table are why frustration exists. If you don't address those things, you're just bringing this new frustration with you to a new place. So you may as well spend the time in your current environment, even if you're in the process of leaving, to continue to get better at what you do. And I think this is the part that's really, really important. Sometimes when we are looking for another opportunity, it actually helps make us better at executing, but also appreciating the opportunity that we currently have. So when I was in pursuit of an executive pastor role, I grew a lot as a leader of people on the team that I was serving, that I was anticipating leaving. And the reason why is because I was pursuing growing in my leadership, because I knew that my next step was going to demand more of me as a leader. And ironically, by pursuing that next step, it helped me grow as a leader where I currently was. So continue to aggressively pursue growth in the role that you're serving in, because it will help you whether you stay or whether you go. So we've defined this fork in the road. Do you want to stay or do you want to move on? In a lot of ways, it doesn't matter what your answer is, in the sense that your next step is to continue to grow. Now, the other side of this, beyond these 4 areas that really you have a lot of control over, you likely have more control over the systems in your creative ministry. You have the opportunity to learn skills, to grow in what you're doing. You have the opportunity and the ability to look inward and assess your heart. How are you doing? Get feedback from others close to you. And you have the ability to be careful about what you're putting into your mind and governing how you are growing and stimulating your imagination, your ability to solve problems. But what happens when the problems, the frustrations that you're currently facing, the things that are making you ask this question in the first place, do I need to leave my job? Is it time to quit? What if those are people problems? What do you do then? There are a couple different things that I have found to be helpful that I would recommend when it comes to people being the reason that you leave. The first is seek restoration. You are never going to have a group of relationships in your life that will have no problems attached. That's just not the way that relationships work. Seeking restoration, specifically those that you're having trouble with or tension with, it's really important to pursue the unity that Scripture calls us to. And so in some cases, you may need to have some of those hard conversations. The goal here is to pursue unity. I had a disagreement with someone on staff, and it reached the point where emotions were visible. We'll put it that way. And I recognized that this was something that had the potential to cause a pretty significant rift in our relationship. And so I sought restoration. I went into their office and I said, look, I don't know what the root of this is, but I do know that right now things aren't great between us. And I want to get to the bottom of what it is, because I care more about our relationship and the unity of the church than I do whatever decision or trajectory or plan. That's not nearly as important. And so if you're having people problems, begin pursuing restoration. In a lot of cases, from the creative side, it means that we have to go in open-handed and willing to ask for forgiveness, to apologize for things that we've done. If these are issues that you believe are not repairable in that type of a conversation, then I recommend you have a conversation with leadership. Bring those issues to leadership. I'm always a big fan of documenting these things. This isn't a matter of like, oh yeah, well, they're just kind of rude and stuff. That's not a sufficient reason for you to want to leave. We need to be resilient in our work, because as we work with people, as we work with broken people, as we work with people who are far from God, that encounter Jesus through interacting with us, either personally or the context of our church, we need to be resilient. There are going to be people that come into our auditoriums, our worship centers, our sanctuaries, whatever you call it. They're going to come in and they're going to be far from God. And our hope is that they leave those spaces nearer to God. But sometimes it's a bumpy road. And that's not much different when it comes to these internal relationships. We don't want to just run away because we've had hard encounters. We want to seek restoration. We want to pursue unity through those hard conversations. But there are times where the interactions or the problems that we have are going beyond that. These can be character problems. These can be ethical problems. There's a lot of different layers, maybe moral problems. These are above a one-on-one seek restoration conversation. These are, I need the help of leadership to help me navigate this stuff. Bring those things to leadership. Articulate to them the challenges or the issues that you're seeing, and then see how they're going to respond. You know, there's this really nuanced problem that happens where, because we see so much of what the church does in creative ministry, we have a real interesting window into the holistic ministry that's happening, but the behind the scenes version of it. And so sometimes what happens is we see these issues that we believe are integrity issues, and we bring it up to leadership. And it's important that we have that conversation, because it's hard for us to have a full view of what is going on in the organization. That's really the job of leadership. So even though we see a lot of things, we don't always see all of the things that went into all of those things. An example of that, we were working with somebody on our team, and they were asking for a project that I felt like financially was bad stewardship. I originally tried to brush it off, and I thought to myself, you know what? it's their job, not mine. I'm going to be fine. I'll just get through it. Well, I was the one who had to hit order. And so all of a sudden now I felt like this amount of money was a burden that I was carrying. And so I went and I talked to the executive pastor. I said, look, here's my concern. This is so much money that I'm being asked to spend for something that I don't see as terribly important or valuable. Can you help me navigate this problem? And it was really helpful because he gave me insight, the executive pastor gave me insight into why this was being approached this way. And at the most basic level, I didn't agree still, but I understood how we got where we got. And I also understood that it isn't my job to be the judger of these things. When you bring some of these things to leadership, you may feel like leadership is flippant about the problems or that they're not addressing them with seriousness. Okay, well then that's an indication to you that there's some sort of a incompatibility or a vision difference between you and the organization. And so that's an indicator as to whether or not you can stay in this organization in a healthy way over the long haul. Think of it that way. As you're going to leadership with these issues, what you're doing is you're getting clarity on where leadership believes the organization should be versus where you believe the organization should be. If you can submit to their leadership, fantastic. If you cannot, then it's probably good for you to continue to move out of the organization. And not just because you're some grumpy person who can't get along, but because this kind of tension will continue to happen. Because, again, the direction that the church is moving is defined by leadership. And so if you're not on board with the direction that they want to go, then you're always going to have problems like this come up. So that's part of the value of bringing this issue to leadership. And then the other value is that leadership may act on this in a way because they didn't have visibility to the problem. So now all of a sudden you're going to the table and you're saying, look, leadership, here's the issue I'm running into. This is the type of situations that, keep happening and it's really problematic. And I just think that somebody needs to know about it. Well, then if the response is, oh man, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. We had no idea this was going on. We weren't aware that this was a problem that was happening in the organization. And now that we know about it, now we can take action. Now we can start addressing it. Now, that's a totally different response than the first scenario of, well, this is the direction we want to go. By bringing it to leadership, what you're doing is you're actually getting insight into how the organization is going to respond to the things that are problems for you. So for me, there were certain issues where I brought it to leadership, and I was really, really thankful that I did, because leadership was very clear with me that they were going to take really proactive steps to address things. Oh man, thank you so much. I'm so thankful that this is the case. I've had other conversations where I have left, I felt shell-shocked a little bit. I was like, are you seriously telling me that this is on purpose? I was assuming somebody was not paying attention at all to this area of ministry. And leadership turns and says, oh, no, that's like literally how we've designed it to be. That is super on purpose. Okay, well, I don't know if I could disagree more than that, but that's what you're looking for. You're looking to see how leadership responds with the information that you're giving. And then if they give you advice, if they give you next steps, I would encourage you to do it. Take the advice of leadership, because ultimately what we're doing as staff members, doesn't matter what ministry you're in, you're submitting to the leadership of the church. You're saying, I trust that leadership will be leading this church in the direction that they believe is where this church should go. If you would like to lead the church, if you'd like to lead the organization in a different direction, then the only pathway for you to do that is to be in leadership. Now, maybe your church says the senior pastor is the one who is leading. Okay, then you need to be a senior pastor. Maybe you have an elder board. Okay, then you need to be an elder. Whatever the seat is that is leadership or driving the leadership of the church, that's the only place that you can sit in and contribute to the direction that the organization is going. So when people problems are the issue, when there's tension, seek restoration. And if it's not something that you feel you can handle or is appropriate for you to handle on your own, bring it to leadership. And then listen to the counsel that they give you. Respond to them and to their recommendations by doing the stuff and pursuing the things that they encourage you to pursue. Now, what this can also do is solidify the opinion or the perspective. You know what? I do want to leave. For me personally, it became very clear that I was not able to make things better in the way that I believed they needed to get better in the organization that I was serving in. And so there are a lot of layers to that, but you may realize that, and that's actually fantastic because clarity is what we're looking for. Then you know it's clear, yes, it's time for me to move on. It's time for me to find another job. Beyond approaching leadership, one of the things I would recommend is to seek counsel outside your church. Internal voices in the church are often biased. This is a really hard one because typically we'll go to the pastors that serve in our churches and we will ask them for their insights and their wisdom and their perspective. But when it comes to matters of being on staff, they actually become a very problematic source of wisdom. And I don't mean that to be a disruptive statement, but the reality is that those who are serving in ministry are likely either okay with what's happening, don't have visibility with what's happening, or maybe don't even think that what's happening is that big of a deal. Well, clearly to you it is, enough where you're asking the question if you should leave. But I have found that pastors are almost always going to encourage you to remain where you are. It's rare that someone will say, yes, you should leave our church. I've never heard that. In fact, I've heard when people have a really amazing opportunity and they share that with people on staff, hey, well, I'm going to be leaving our team and going to this other opportunity. Just feel like God opened doors and such a clear call to go in this direction. The response is, well, don't let the door hit you on the way out. We are really, really bad at celebrating the fact that God is moving people around for his purposes. And so I would encourage you to find somebody on the outside. I always start with spouse. That's a great first step if you're married. The other group for me would be close friends. Who are the people in your life that know you and you can kind of speak candidly about this stuff? I have a good friend who doesn't serve at a church, and I cannot tell you what a blessing he is in my life because he gives me wisdom and perspective from outside. Now, that doesn't always mean that I listen to the advice that he gives, but he gives me a perspective. And that's really what's helpful, is getting perspective. So seek counsel outside your church. And then the last one here is to pray about it. Pray that God would work in the hearts of the people around you. There were seasons for me where I had to pray that God would help me want to pray that those things would happen. I was a couple steps removed from actually praying about it. That's how frustrated I was. That's such a great place to start. Just begin praying about it and have these conversations about what a next step could look like. Part of this is remembering that your identity is found in Christ, not in your job. That's a really difficult one for many of us in ministry because we think, no, we're doing the Lord's work. We're serving God through what we do. The reality is that we need to be attentive to our relationship with God, not our job for God. And when we pray about it, in a lot of ways what we're doing is we're prioritizing the relationship over anything else. And be honest. Come to God and tell him, look, I'm really frustrated by these things that are happening. I don't feel like these are right. I don't feel like these are good. I don't feel like ministry is moving in the direction that it should be moving. God can handle those concerns or those frustrations. And I want you to hear, you may be right in all of the things that you're bringing to the table. But ultimately, leadership is the one who is put in position to make those decisions. And that's where you trust that God is doing the work that he wants to be doing. At the end of the day, part of the power of praying about these things is it is a very intentional step for us to say, God, this is yours, not mine. And you move me where you want me to be. There are seasons where you may be called to be a disruptor. There are seasons for me where I look back and I see that God was using me, even though I was getting a lot of no's and I was frustrated about it. There are other seasons where I could see that pretty much everything that I recommended was completely disregarded. Let God use you the way that he desires to use you. Just because God's using you doesn't mean that you're going to get yeses to all the things that you ask for. Whether you decide that, yes, it is time for you to move on, or, you know what, I'm going to lean in and I'm going to try to make my workplace better. I'm going to try to solve some of these problems. It doesn't matter what your decision is there, as long as you remember that your identity is found in Christ and not in your job. That will travel with you wherever you go. And that's how I would answer the question. Is it time for me to quit my job?
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Healthy Creative Ministry Podcast. This podcast is just one of the ways Lunchtime Heroes can help you build a healthy creative ministry in your church. Stay up to date on the latest by signing up for the Creative Bites email at lunchtimeheroes.co.